Okay, so here are my welt pocket pieces. I've cut them out and this is my pattern piece here. I like to use Vilene because I can trace on it and I can see through, and it just sticks to fabric and doesn't flap around. So if I place this pattern piece on top of the welt pocket piece, you can see that the interfacing is showing through, and that's in line with what would have been the dashed lines on the pattern piece. And I've ironed them on. I've also got the markers for these notches which will line up with the side seam, and I have done little snips there, but I can also just mark that with a friction pen. I've tested this on fabric so I know that the marks will erase. So that's the wrong side of the fabric. Now if I turn the fabric over to the right side, I need to mark where the dashed line of the welt will go. So again, I've made little snips in line with the pattern piece, so I can just mark those again on this side with the friction pen. I'll do that on both sides. And then I'm going to take my ruler, which also just happens to be the same width, which is 4 centimeters, and I'm just going to draw a line on each side of the ruler which is in line with those notches. So I'll do that on this side as well. Just drawing them on. And the other notches that I need to mark are those center notches of the welt. So I mark that there and up there. I've got little snips in the fabric as well, but this just helps. So that's on the right side. I'm going to flip it over onto the wrong side, and now I need to actually mark where that welt shape goes. So I've got my center marking, and if you've lost it, just pop your pattern piece back on top, and I'm just going to mark that top and bottom. I'm going to draw a line straight through the center. Then I'm going to mark 1 centimeter each side, which is the width of the welt, like so. Just be careful too when you're using something like a friction pen, like this felt tip one. It's got fat and thin sides. If you make your lines too thick, so I'm using the thin end of the wedge to draw my lines. I find the felt tip pen works nicely on fabric, but if I was to use the fat edge, my lines would be too big. Next, I need to mark the top of the welt. So if I look on my pattern piece, I can see that's 3 centimeters down, and the welt itself measures 12. So I'm going to measure down 3, and then plus the 12 is 15, so I mark that. So I'll do that on both sides, so 3, 15, turning it around and mark the top of the welt and the bottom of the welt, and then I'm just going to mark in the triangle shape that I'm going to need to snip after I've sewn it. So I'll do the same thing on this one. The other way I could do it is, I know that my interfacing is 4 centimeters wide. I can mark 1, 2, 3 at the top, and 1, 2, 3 on the bottom, and draw those lines in. Now this is going to be on the inside because it's the interfacing, and I know that even if a shadow is left from this marker, it's going to be fine because it's on the inside. So marking down 3 centimeters plus the 12, which is 15. So 3 and 15, marking across the top and the bottom, and just drawing in the triangle for my snip line, like so. So we have a look at that. We've got the welt drawn onto the interfacing, which is on the wrong side of the fabric, and when I flip that over, I've got my dashed lines drawn on the right side of the fabric, making sure that you have checked that those lines will erase, either with heat or brushing off if you're using chalk. Okay, so these are my front pieces of my wrap. This example, I'm doing the welt pocket on the wrap. The same principle applies to the cape as well. This is the right side up of my wrap, and this is the center front. Next, I'm going to take my welt pocket pieces and I'm going to put them down right sides together. I'm going to start with this one first. as I mentioned before, I've got snips along the sides of my welt pocket piece, but I've also got snips on the sides of my front drapes on the wrap as well. So there's a snip there and a snip there. Again, I could have marked those with a pen. Next, I'm going to line up the snip with this pocket with the snip on the side. So you can see there's a little snip there and the snip there. And I'm going to pop a pin in to hold that in place. Next, I'm going to line up the bottom snips. And they're lined up. And I'm going to put a pin in place. Now, I don't want this moving while I'm sewing it, so I'm just going to pop a few more pins around just to keep it all in place. So, right sides together, notches lined up, pinned in place. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Line up my notches with the sides and with the pocket, and put some pins to keep it secure. Now what you'll notice is that the pocket bag appears to be larger than the actual front of the jacket, and that's because with this technique we're actually going to be folding the welts in, so it needs to be larger in order for it to end up fitting. So there are my two welt pocket pieces pinned onto the front of the wrap. Okay, now I'm going to sew around the welt shape. It's a good idea to set your stitch lengths to being a little bit smaller, because when you go around those corners you want them to be really secure. So I'm going to start off, got my foot up, and I'm just going to turn the needle so it's exactly into the corner. Then I'm just going to start sewing. So I'm going to do 3 stitches forward, 3 stitches back, and then carry on straight down, following that line that I've drawn, coming to the corner. And I'm going to hand turn my wheel to make sure that I am exactly in that corner. And a little tip for having nice stitches in your corner is to make sure that your needle is right down before you lift the foot and pivot. So coming across, so the needle's right down, lift the foot, pivot, so down the other long side, needle right down, pivot, and close the rectangle, back tapping and coming forward by single stitch. And then I'm going to just cut those threads. So you can see I've stitched around the rectangle, and on the other side you can just see the rectangle. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, now I'm going to remove the pins, and this is the scariest part of making welts for me, is actually cutting it, because I don't know, maybe I've got some trust issues. So the way to do it, or the way I do it, is I fold it in half and pinch it so it's nice and straight, and just do a little snip along that center drawn line, open it out, lay it flat on my table, and cut along till I get to those snipping triangles, then snip up to the corner, snip up to the corner, turn around and come back in the other direction. Snip to the corner and snip to the corner. Okay, so I'll do the same on the other side. So, right sides together. I'm going to turn the pocket through to the wrong side. Give it a little pull to make sure the edges are nice and sharp. I fold one part of the pocket out of the way, and along that fold line where the violin is, I'm just going to finger press and where the fold line is, finger press, and then just finger press along that violin. So you can see it's folded top and bottom, and this part is sticking out. I'm going to fold that out of the way, fold this one back, finger press my fold, and again I could iron this if I'd used chalk and I wasn't worried that the chalk was going to disappear, I would. And so that's out of the way. Now I've got my 2 lines and I just need to sew those lines. So I'm going to use a yellow thread because that contrasts really well with this beautiful orange. It's a nice long thread, and I'm just going to start sewing my ladder stitch. So a little stitch to start with, and then sewing my ladder. Now it's really important that with your ladder stitch you do come straight across. If you don't come straight across, your welt might not line up straight. So you could, if you wanted to, actually mark 1 centimeter dots the whole way along, which would help just ensure that you're getting it perfectly lined up. Okay, so I've finished sewing my ladder stitch. I hold that firmly, you can see it's nice and straight. On the other side, following the line of the interfacing. Now you'll also notice that because I pressed this out of the way, this part hasn't caught on there, and that's important. So just check on both sides that that hasn't caught into your stitching line. Next, you can pull that thread. So you can either pull it from each end, like so, or you can actually just sort of pull it a little bit as you go, which might actually even be easier. There we go. Yes, I think that was easier. And that's nice and straight from that side. If I flip it over to the front, I can see my welt is looking beautiful. And now I'm ready to sew those corners again. So once again, just give that a little pull on those corners, just gently, just to stop any kind of puckering that might happen. Of course, that will come out when it's pressed anyway. So right way up, fold the top over, and you've got your plate. So we're going to just stitch that down at the bottom, just to stay stitched. I don't need to back tack. Then I'm going to fold the triangle out of the way and fold my fabric along that stitching edge so it's really nice and sharp, and I'm going to stitch almost on top of the stitching line, but not quite. And again, you can see there, I've not caught the fabric on that fold, it's literally just the triangle. So turn that around, fold that one out of the way, fold this one to reveal the triangle, and I'm just going to trim that yellow thread. And I'm going to stay stitch the bottom. To keep it in place. And then I'm going to fold the triangle out of the way, making sure that my fabric is nice and straight, folded in line with it so it doesn't get in the way, and stitch that little triangle down. Trim off my threads. Then I fold that back. We can see the welt is ready for pressing, and on the back of the welt it's nice and neat. So I'm just going to go and give that a press. Okay, so I've just pressed my welts and you can see they're looking beautiful. If I turn them over to the wrong side, you can also see that now that pocket bag is matching perfectly with the sides. So now I need to just sew the pocket lining onto my pocket bag. I'm just making sure those yellow threads are out of the way. Now this fabric that I'm using is a lightweight wool, which is beautiful. It's not too heavy, and I'm going to line it with a silk and cotton. So I'm actually going to line my pocket bag using the outer fabric. I could use a contrast fabric. If my fabric was very thick, I would definitely use a lining fabric, but in this instance my lining fabric is quite fine and I don't think it's really strong enough for the pocket bag, and this just gives it a nice continuous colour anyway. So I've lined up my pocket lining to the welt pocket fabric, and I'm just going to pop a pin in top and bottom, not through to the main part, just the pockets together, like so. Do that on both sides. Like so. Okay, now I'm ready to just join them. So I'm just going to sew them along the top edges and the bottom edges. So the easiest way to do that is to flip it over so that it's the right way out. Turn it sideways, and I'm just going to fold the outer fabric out of the way, and now I can see my edges there. So I'm just going to sew along this edge. So back tucking, sewing straight across, making sure my yellow thread is out of the way. Straight across, snip my threads, turn it around, fold the top part out of the way, and then fold it back again to show my pocket, and stitch along the bottom edge. So having stay stitched that little fold down, it means it's not going to move, but at the same time by sewing it this way up, I'm just ensuring that nothing's shifting, and it just makes life much easier. So I snip those threads, fold that back over and turn it to the wrong side. Now I don't actually need to overlock these edges of the pocket because it's going to be concealed in the lining anyway, but what I do want to do is just stay stitched down those sides in preparation for sewing the lining to the outer. So again, I don't need to back tack, I'm just going to sew down, cut those threads, turn that around and come back up this way. Now just make sure that when you are sewing and stay stitching that you're keeping this bottom edge nice and even. You don't want to sort of let that pocket bag drag down. So just true it up again, make sure it's straight, and sew back the other side. And trim those threads. One thing you might find is that when you're doing a welt pocket, if you're using a particularly thick outer fabric, it could sort of shrink the welts down a bit and they could end up not quite matching on the sides. If that's the case, all you have to do is make your seam allowance slightly bigger and no one will even know. Okay, now for the fun bit, we're going to take that yellow thread that we did the ladder stitch with, and we're just going to gently pull that out like so. Should come out nice and easily. Turn it over to the front, and there you have a perfect welt pocket. Okay, I'm just going to sew the pocket bag on the other side. Turning it to the tricky thread. And there you have it. And you can give that another little press if you want. Okay, and that's the welt pockets done. So next I'm going to sew up the wrap.